Morning, y'all. Hey, if you got a Bible, would you open up with me to Psalms 86? Psalm 86 is where we're going to be this morning. If you're new or visiting with us this morning, welcome. We're beginning a new series today, and the whole idea behind this stems from, in large part, a response to what's kind of happened in our world over the past several years. And so what I mean by that is today our new series is called Foundations, where we're going back and we're going to try to answer over the next 4 weeks what I think are 4 essential questions that give direction and shape to how we live our lives in a confused world. And so today we're going to look at the question, what is God? Next week we'll look at what is a person? And week 3 we're going to talk about where do we find hope, or is there any hope for any of us? And then the last week, where are we going as the people of God? I read a book a few weeks back, or I started a book a few weeks back called Strange New World by Carl Trueman. Carl Trueman's a Christian theologian and thinker, and essentially he takes the last 50 or 60 years of philosophical and social thought in the Western world and traces out how our world has gotten to the place that it is, where we're confused about very simple things, or what we've often taken for granted as simple things like gender and sexuality and the nature of institutions, and basically says, how did we get here? And so in light of that sort of moment that we find ourselves in as a culture and as a people, we were going to go back to some of the foundations, some of these things that Christians have clung to in times of uncertainty and in times of confusion, to give an orientation to God and to the world in the way that he intended. And so today we pick up in Psalm 86, answering again the question, what is God? David writes in Psalm 86, beginning in verse 8, "There is none like you among the gods, O Lord, nor are there any works like yours. All the nations you have made shall come and worship before you, O Lord, and shall glorify your name. For you are great and do wondrous things. You alone are God. Teach me your way, O Lord, that I may walk in your truth. Unite my heart to fear your name. I give thanks to you, O Lord my God, with my whole heart, and I will glorify your name forever. For great is your steadfast love toward me, and you have delivered my soul from the depths of Sheol. But you, O Lord, are a merciful God and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness." This is the word of the Lord. At the church that I pastored before, I came to Living Hope some 16 years ago now. One of my best friends there was a guy named Kendall. Kendall worked with me in the youth ministry when I was a youth pastor there, and was just a humble, godly guy. And his day job was he installed tornado shelters, these big, massive, like sheet metal, not sheet metal, like really thick metal built rooms that he would take and put in people's garages. And so a guy actually in our church had designed this particular model, and so Kendall would go all around the country, mostly in Oklahoma and Kansas, Texas, putting these things in. And one day he called me. He's like, "Hey man, I got a job, and the guy that usually helps me put the safe room in, he quit this morning, he got occupied, couldn't come. Can you come help me install this?" And I'm like, "Man, I'm the least mechanically inclined person on the planet. There's no way I can help you." He's like, "No, I can work with whatever skills you got." And so I get there, and he's got this gigantic corrugated metal, I think is what it's called, building on the back of a trailer, and he's got to get it off and then put it in this person's garage and then anchor it down to their foundation. And so he lines up like 4 PVC pipes and then has the building, the safe room, roll off the trailer. And he's like, "All I need you to do is just kind of catch it as it comes down." And I'm like, "What?" He's like, "No, trust me. I've put thousands of these in. It works just fine." And so it did. And by God's grace, that was the only part of the whole thing I had to do, was just to help him get it off the trailer. But then he's like, "Hey man, you may want to like walk around the corner or leave or find some earplugs, because I've got to fix this thing to the foundation." So he pulls out this massive drill. And it's got a really long, look like a piece of metal on the end of it, and he starts drilling into the foundation of this home. And he drills for what seems like an hour, and I'm standing back with my hands over my ears. It is so excruciatingly loud. And then he pulls out like a big piece of like rebar or something. I don't know what I'm talking about if y'all can't tell. And puts that down in and then fastens it to this building and the safe room. And I said, "Man, does this really work?" He pulls out his phone and he's like, yeah, here's a picture of this giant tornado had gone through Kansas a few months prior. And when the helicopter comes and flies over and surveys the damage, it showed a subdivision where every home was leveled, foundations exposed, but there was one of their safe rooms still just sitting there amidst all the rubble. And he's like, yeah, if I can get the pillars down beneath the foundation, it won't go anywhere. It'll weather any storm. We've had this thing tested by engineers and put wind turbines that shoot things at it at like 500 miles an hour and they just splinter and fall apart. But you gotta get down into the foundation. And I think about that often when I think about where we find ourselves in our particular cultural moment in Western civilization. We're kind of in a storm. We're in a vortex of confusion. I don't know if you've caught wind of it. Maybe you've been in a bunker the last 5 or 10 years and you haven't seen any of this. And if so, welcome. We're glad you're here today. But there's just so many what seem to be foundational questions about humanity and about civilization and about the nature of relationships and religion and God that have kind of like popcorn begun to heat up and start bursting around us. And so in these moments, how do we weather the storm? How do we find our bearings? How do we get a grip on what seems to be lasting and true and unchanging? And so that's why we're doing this series this morning. That's why we're talking about these foundational questions. For centuries now, for 2 millennia, Christians have asked particular questions about the scriptures and about life, things that are typically confined in catechisms. What is God, as the Westminster Confession asks? What is the nature of humanity, as things like the Heidelberg Catechism would ask? How do we have any hope in life or in death? And we're going to go back over the next several weeks and drill down, just as my friend did, drill down our anchors, hopefully, into these foundations so that in the coming days, in the coming months, in the coming years, as the storm of confusion continues to rage around us, we're not blown away by it. So today we're asking the question, what is God? And Psalm 86, I think, gives us some anchors, some things that we can latch onto, some truths about who God is in his nature and in his person, that if we can grasp these things, no matter what would come at us, we could hold on to the truth and the hope that is found in the person of God. I think that before you can even begin to ask the question of what is a person, which is what we're going to look at next week, or where do we find hope, which is what we'll look at in week 3, or where is all of this thing going, human history, before we can ask any of those questions, we've got to begin with the foundational question, what is God? And what I hope to show you this morning is basically 3 things from Psalm 86. The first one is that God is greater. God is greater. Now, I think to be grammatically correct, I need an object at the end of that. God is greater than what? But I purposefully left that off because it doesn't matter what goes there. God is greater. It doesn't matter. And that's what David is writing for us in this prayer in Psalm 86. He begins with this foundational truth. No matter what you see in creation, no matter what problem or foe or enemy or idea or ideology, whatever the thing is, God is greater. Look back at verse 8. David says, "There is none like you among the gods, O Lord, nor are there any works like yours." In other words, there's nothing that you can be compared to. You are beyond all things. He goes on in verse 9, "All the nations you have made shall come and worship before you, O Lord, and shall glorify your name." There is no nation state, no socio-political entity. There is nothing in all of creation that can be compared to the entity or the being that we call God. And when we talk about God being greater, I want to really kind of drill down on 2 specific attributes or 2 particular characteristics that David brings up in this prayer about God that I think become the anchors that we can latch onto, the truths that we can mast ourselves to in the midst of a storm so that we're not blown away by all the confusion. The first thing that we see that David says is that God is greater because he's distinct. God is distinct. There is nothing like God in all of creation. This is a foundational principle, idea, and truth that must be grasped if we are to be the people of God in the world. The New City Catechism, I mentioned Catechism a minute ago. Catechism is just a way of teaching and training and instilling truth in hearts and lives of followers of Jesus, and has been for quite some time. The New City Catechism is a relatively newer version of these truths, but I love the way that it asks this particular question. Question number 2 in the New City Catechism: what is God? And here's the answer. It sounds very much like Psalm 86. God is the creator and sustainer of everyone and everything. Now I could camp there and preach that for weeks. God is the creator, everything originates from him, and sustainer. Everything is held together by him. This is Genesis 1 and this is Colossians 1 coming together. Genesis 1, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. If you get the first 10 words of the Bible right, most of life then begins to fall into place. If you get it wrong, everything begins to come untethered. Paul would write to the church in Colossae that everything is held together by Jesus and exists for Jesus, so that in him in all things he may be preeminent. That means above all things. So the question is answered. He is eternal and infinite and unchangeable in his power and perfection, his goodness and glory, wisdom, justice, and truth. And here's the truth of why God is distinct. Nothing happened except through him and by his will. God is distinct. And secondly, I think when we look at Psalm 86, we see that God is also omnipotent. God is all-powerful. That's back in verse 13. For great is your steadfast love towards me. You've delivered my soul from the depths of Sheol, David writes. If there's no power, even the power of death itself, even the power of hell itself, God has power over that. He is all-powerful. And those two qualities is why God is greater. He's distinct from all things in creation, and he's all-powerful. He's omnipotent. He's more powerful than anything in all of creation. Now, why do I need to make those 2 points? Because there's a lot at stake if you miss these two realities. Again, in the midst of our cultural confusion, in the sea of all the questions that hit us, that are being forced upon us, the barrage of not knowing what is true, right, good, or beautiful these days, if you miss out on these two particular attributes of God, you'll miss out on what is foundational to the Christian faith. Why? If you fail to see that God is distinct, you'll eventually just become pagan or humanistic. What do I mean by that? If you fail to see that God is distinct from anything and everything in creation, then the only way you can come to conclusions about truth is to observe creation. The only way that you can come to any conclusion about the nature of truth is to observe what is material. You become a materialist, essentially. You become a humanist, basically meaning that human beings are the crowning achievement of all of creation, which we are, but we only know that because God has revealed that about his person and character and worth in his word. And if you fail to see God as distinct, and when you become pagan, you begin to worship and serve created things rather than your creator. Right? So Romans chapter 1, the Apostle Paul writes to the church in Rome and says, basically, in the first century, confusion was abounding then as well. In other words, as the book of Ecclesiastes tells us, there's nothing new under the sun. The present confusion that we have over all these essential foundational things about life and nature itself, this isn't new. Human beings have been tripping over these things since Genesis chapter 3. Paul writes this in Romans chapter 1. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who by their unrighteousness, and here's the problem with us, suppress the truth. So we hear the truth about who God is. God has revealed the truth to us, but we push that down. And then Paul says something very dangerous begins to happen. For what can be known about God is plain to them because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power, there it is, and his divine nature have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made. So we are without excuse. For although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him. They became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, here's the human predicament, claiming to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man and birds and animals and creeping things. Verse 24, therefore God gave them up in the lusts of their hearts to impurity, to the dishonoring of their bodies among themselves, because they exchanged the truth about God for a lie and worshiped and served the creature rather than the Creator who is blessed forever. Amen. What's Paul saying there? Paul essentially says that the human predicament is, in creation, we can look around and we can see we didn't come up with this. We didn't birth this whole thing into existence. There's a being that's beyond us and distinct from us. If there is a creation, there must be a creator. And although we see that and we acknowledge that, we suppress that truth, Paul says, in unrighteousness. We want to push that down because it's uncomfortable and unsettling. And then what happens, because the worship switch can't be deactivated in any of our hearts, we were wired by God to worship. We'll talk about that next week. We begin worshiping and serving created things rather than our creator. Our orientation will move towards things of creation rather than creator, and we'll begin worshiping things of the creation. And Paul says when that happens, we exchange something. We exchange the truth of God for a lie. This big exchange happens where we begin worshiping creature rather than creator. If we fail to see that God is distinct from creation, that's what happens to us. If we fail to see that he's unlike anything, that he is over but separate from all things, we turn into humanists or pagans or idolaters. Also, if you fail to see that God is omnipotent, this is another danger in store for us. This is what David is talking about here in Psalm 86. If you fail to see that God is omnipotent, you'll be seduced by power and control. That's why David makes the point in verse 9. Look, God is greater than all creation. All the nations will come to him. In other words, every political power, every king, every person that occupies the halls of power, those who believe they get to make the rules, all of them will come and bow before the Lord at some point. And if you don't realize that that's the case, then whatever power or control that they put on offer for you, that will seduce you. If you don't see that the nations come to God, it's not that God is a puppet for the nations. He's not a prop in the background of their political ploys or ideas. He's the Lord over all the nations. If you fail to see that he's powerful, then you'll be seduced by this idea that you can get control, that you can get power, that you can be ruling, that you can be like God. After all, that was the original lie that got us into this mess to begin with. If you eat from that tree, nothing bad will really happen. God just doesn't want you to be like him. And so the people of God then must acknowledge what David writes here in Psalm 86, that God is greater, that God is distinct, that he's all powerful, that he's different from us. God's greater than our fears. He's greater than whatever issue you're facing in your job or in your marriage or in your family. He's greater than your health or whatever disease may be in front of you. He's greater than your finances. He's greater than your political enemies. He's greater than your sin. He's greater than everything. And that foundation is what we drill down into in order to be the people of God in the world for the glory of God. In fact, that's what's next. David says in Psalm 86, God is glorious. That word glory is kabod, I think. It means weight. It means that God has more weight, more mass. If he's all-powerful, if he's distinct, then he's the bigger being. And in him is where we find what it is that is true. We find our bearings in God. We are oriented around who he is and what he has said to be good, true, right, and beautiful. If God created the world and God sustains the world, and if he's the powerful being that is operating as the sovereign Lord over all of creation, then we can only know what direction to head. We can only know true north in God. I've told you all before, my dad was a coon hunter, and so most of his hunting happened at night. And he would take me with him whenever I was a little kid. So we'd go wander off. We lived near a national forest, near Corps of Engineer land. You could go off into the sticks with like no civilization for hours, not see a road, a car, anything. And so all we would have is like my dad would have a light on his head and a couple beers in his hand, and we'd go wandering off in the woods. It's not a good recipe for anything positive to happen. But we would get out in the middle of the woods at night chasing dogs to, who knows where, and not know where we were. And my dad would always have his compass on him. And he taught me even when I was a little kid, look, son, he pulled the compass out. You can always find north. You can always be redirected in the way that you should go. And essentially, that's what David is saying here about God. God is, without God, we don't know which way to go. Confusion is the norm. These foundational questions, what is a person? What is right? Is there a hierarchy in people? All of that, we don't know the answer to those questions, so we'll just make stuff up unless God has revealed it to us. That's why David says what he says in verse 11. Teach me your way, O Lord, that I may walk in your truth. Unite my heart to fear your name. Left to myself, I don't know what direction to go. Lord, you are the compass. Only in you do we have our bearings. Only in you do we know which direction to head. Otherwise, we're just left to our own limited faculties and abilities, our own limited intelligence. And that is a scary thought, y'all. In fact, let me prove it to you. Okay, so we're just kind of completing the season of high school reunions. I'm just curious, anyone go to a high school reunion this summer? Anyone? I think this was number 25 for me. I think since Facebook became a thing, you don't have to do this anymore, right? Like I don't need to go back and look people in the eye that at the moment when I knew them, I was at my most insecure and making the worst decisions of my life. Like that can live back there. I'll look at pictures of your kids through the medium of Facebook. We're good, right? But think about this. In the times of high school reunions, you always get posed with this question because there's always the dude that still wears his leather jacket and would go back tomorrow if he could, right? If that's you, let's move on. So, but you always hear the whole concept is pitched like this. If I could go back then knowing what I know now, right? You've probably said that at some point, whether it was in high school or middle school or early in your marriage, whatever. You always have this early in parenting. If I could go back then knowing what I know now. Now think about that. Think about that setup. Think about what you're telling yourself. You're saying that now that 10, 15, 20 years has passed, if I look in the rearview mirror, the me from 10 or 15 years ago was kind of an idiot. Now, listen closely. I hate to be the bearer of bad news. Guess what you're going to think about yourself 15 years from now? Right? If I could go back to when I was 30, if I could go back to when I was 50, knowing if I knew then what I know now, you realize that never stops, right? So if that's the case, if at this moment you can acknowledge with me that you're not going to get likely dumber 10 years from now, you're going to realize that there were some gaps in your thinking at this moment 10 years from now. If that's the case, doesn't it make sense that we have to be delivered from our own insane thinking, from our own inability to reason our way through life? Something outside of us has to interject into our own consciousness and say, hey, hold on, wake up, that isn't the way. Like left to ourselves, we don't know which way is north. We don't know which way is right. We don't know which way to go. And David says, look, Lord, teach me your way. You are glorious. You are the weightier being. You are the one with mass. You are the one who exists outside of me. I don't know what direction to head without you. I must rely upon you. I've got to acknowledge my limits. Humility is the default disposition of anyone who actually understands the gospel. It has to be. Because no one gets in on God because they earned their way there. The entrance requirement for following the way of the Lord is to admit you do not know what to do with your life. You're utterly helpless and lost apart from God. That's how this whole thing was designed to work. Because God is glorious. And God is worthy of our worship, David says. He says, look, the nations will come to you. The nations will lift you up. Why? Because you're the bigger being. You are the one with weight. You are the one with mass. You are the one with glory. And the bigger being gets the honor and gets the glory. It's what we were designed for, to worship something outside of ourselves, beyond ourselves, something outside of creation, right? College football season is about to start. I love college football season. I look forward to those Saturdays more than maybe any other Saturdays on the calendar. But 18 to 22-year-olds running around on a field for a couple of hours is not worthy of my worship. And I know we're going to go through ritualistic worship-like practices. We're going to make animal sacrifice. We're going to put it on the grill, chicken wings or whatever. We're going to sing our worship hymns together and our chants. You know, we're going to go through all the practices of worship. And it is, y'all, that in the SEC, there's, you know, that we border on idolatry every Saturday. But it's not worth it. It doesn't matter what you put in that blank. It's not worth it because it's not weighty enough. It's not big enough. Shouldn't control our hearts and our lives, but God is. Several years ago, one of my friends, he's kind of a well-known pastor, preacher, speaker type, but he was a college wrestler. When I say college wrestler, not like a guy who made it on like a JV squad for a junior college. He was an All-American at like a really big school. 2-time All-American, I think, national champion. Huge person. He's a big, big dude. And he told me he was speaking at an event where he was in like the green room, the room behind the stage, preparing, looking over his notes, and a tour bus type thing pulls up, and this big entourage gets out that's preceding whoever's about to get off the bus. And this little bitty guy, he said, walks into the room and says, hey, Pastor so-and-so is about to walk through here because he's set to speak. When he walks through, you're going to need to stand up and show him honor. And my friend who was sitting at the time had to be the only reason why this little person would rationally think to tell this guy this thing. But he said, you're going to need to stand up. And my friend just said he didn't even acknowledge it. He just kept looking at his notes. And the guy inches a little bit closer and kind of stands over. He's like, hey, did you hear me? Pastor so-and-so is about to walk in. You're going to need to stand up. And my buddy at that time just kind of raises up. And as he does, he says he just slides his arm underneath the guy's like armpit and just lifts him off the ground with one arm. And says, hey, if Pastor so-and-so wants me to stand up, just tell him to come tell me. And set him down. And the guy goes, yes, sir. Walked out. He said he never saw the guy, right? Why did he do that? Because the bigger being gets the honor and the glory. The little guy doesn't get to tell the big guy what to do. David says, we come and worship before the Lord because he's the bigger being. We check our ego. We check our hubris. All the questions and presuppositions that we have about the way we think the world works. We didn't create the world. We were designed to worship something bigger than us, more glorious than us. And this foundational element, David says, is at the very heart of what it means to be a follower of God and to enact his kingdom in his world for his glory. Lastly, David says that God is not just glorious, he's also gracious. Look back at verse 13. For great is your steadfast love toward me. You have delivered my soul from the depths of Sheol. Verse 15. But you, O Lord, are a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness. God's character and his essence are gracious, David says. The very being of being, at the heart of God, is this self-disclosure that he is a God filled with grace, filled with love, and filled with mercy. The primary heart of God's character and nature is that of grace. He points back to what Moses got to hear God say back in Exodus chapter 20 when the glory of God passed over Moses. Moses couldn't look upon God. He couldn't see God. God says, I'm too glorious. I'm so much bigger than you. Basically, you will melt. You will come undone. But when God passes over, and in that moment where we feel really, really small as we should, and God feels really, really glorious as he is, what does God choose to say? It's really important. If in that moment where the gap between who we are and who God is gets exposed, what God says next is what we really need to tune into. He says, I'm the Lord, I'm Yahweh, God who is slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love, and I will be faithful to generations. In that gap, that space of our infinite smallness held up to the light of God's infinite bigness, he wants to tell us something. And what he wants to tell us is, I'm not a threat in the way that you think that I am. I am a God who is slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love, which is why in all of the confusion of our age, it is all about faith. Do we believe that we lack the ability to know which way to go in our life? And if we do, is there a God who has revealed himself to us? And if he has, will he be kind, gentle, and gracious towards us? And he has. The person of Jesus in his embodiment of the very nature and essence of God's being shows us that God is a God who is slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love. Jesus says, I am gentle and lowly at heart. Come to me and you will find rest for your weary souls. God's desire is for you to know and experience his great love. Look again at verse 13. I give thanks to you, O Lord my God, with my whole heart. For great is your steadfast love towards me. You have delivered my soul from the depths of Sheol. That's David saying. You're not just great at loving, it is great to me. David has experienced that love. It's not a theory, it's not an idea. And until it becomes an experience by faith, we'll continue to get tossed around by the storms of confusion raging around us. Until we know for sure that God is a God who is slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love and will be faithful to us even when we are not faithful to him, as Paul says. Because he cannot deny himself. Until we are anchored in that, the confusion of the day the nonsense that swirls around us, that we're being seduced to believe, that if we will just check this box or say yes to this idea, then we'll have the power and the control. God comes up against that. The very foundation of his person and his character is that he's glorious and he's greater, but he's also gracious to us. So Lord, this morning, incline our hearts to trust in your grace, to revel in your glory. Lord, let us by faith believe that you are greater than anything we face, any power, any threat, any enemy, or any danger. And let us find rest. Let us find refuge. Let us find renewal for our souls in you and in you alone. We pray these things in the name of Jesus. Amen.